Hello, today I'll be talking about Phoenician style sand core glassware, what I saw on eBay, and this guide will hopefully tell you about some of the things out there. The Phoenicians came from modern day Lebanon, from ports Tyre, Sidon and Byblos, and they conquered the Mediterranean. They basically traded the glassware all around the Mediterranean and made it famous, and that's why it's called Phoenician glassware. Even though it wasn't naturally made by them, it was definitely discovered by the Syrians and they made use of it. And the Phoenicians, you can see, very simple boats for getting around the Mediterranean, but by the time you get to ocean-going vehicles, they have strong sides to repel the waves. And they conquered Africa and they circumnavigated around the planet. And the Phoenicians lived just like us. They had a building just like us with all modern amenities you can imagine. The Phoenicians also had a hand in co-creating the modern handwriting. You can see that the Phoenician symbol here is on this plaque which was found in Cyprus. They also had their own coinage, and you can see something that looks maybe like a bird or a cockerel on the coins that they had all the way back in that time. And bronze, definitely in the Bronze Age, you can see this bronze dagger which was discovered at Byblos. That's what they carved their instruments of war out of, bronze. And if they couldn't do that, then they used arrowheads, and the arrow and the bow and the arrow was definitely their preferred weapon. You can see that they were cast, and I think they were cast firstly out of stone and then later on out of bronze, and I'm not sure whether these are in fact glass arrowheads that they managed to craft from the glassware which we are about to see. But you can see a shaft there where you can put the pointy stick, and hopefully the pointy end can be kept sharp. And bronze isn't that easy to keep sharp, but you can, with a stone, scrub the edges of that, and that's why some of the edges of these arrowheads are well worn. The Phoenician glassware culture started in Syria and Israel, and it filtered its way down through the Levant and all the way up to modern day Constantinople, Istanbul, and they, around that kind of area, popularised glassware by putting it in a kiln underground, firing up to a high temperature, and they managed to get ordinary sand mixed with common elements to turn different colours, and this is organic glass from the very first discoveries that they made. And yes, glassware did come a long way, but it's very ancient, and maybe 2500 BC is when the first examples appear. Before that, everything was cast from stone, and these are precious stones, agate, and these are fashioned in the shape of beads. Perhaps 1000 BC, for all we know. This was ancient technology, and very early humans crafted this. But when they invented glass, they discovered that they could put clay rods with some limestone covering them, and they could form things using clay and forming things out of raw materials which they could grind down into colours, and by firing that up into a kiln it would make something. You can even drip glass onto these rods, and that's what made the core forming process, which we can read on this page. The core forming, you can form anything from a candlestick to a jug or an amphora using that method. The very earliest core formed beads you can see are very simple sand core examples, and I'm not sure how they managed to colour the outer shell. Maybe they used precious stones ground down to create those colours, and you can see very simple examples, and maybe they even daubed glass on the sides of them. You can see daubed glass there, and that has perhaps even been refired in these early examples of the Phoenician glassware. So maybe if you crack these things open, you will find the sand core in the middle. But you can see they were highly decorated back in the day with whatever materials they could get hold of, and they could come in all shapes and sizes. You can see this one, they've painted the outside and used a sharp stick to move the paint down and then perhaps refired it, and that's part now of the glass which makes up the outside surface of these sand core items that you can see on the screen. And these faces we will return to a little bit later on, and if these remind you of African tribal symbols and watermelons and all kinds of things African, well yes, some of these did come from North Africa. Don't forget Carthage was a Phoenician territory, and so this technology did spread and did get roots from Africa. And all these tribal symbols, the dots you can see and the shapes, are supposed to be symbols to keep away enemies, and you can see faces there, hopefully to ward off evil spirits. And they also painted from the very simple stripy effect. You can also see that they did go to great lengths to hand paint these and refire them so that the paint is within the glass. And you can see huge ones here. Maybe these hung around the neck in a huge necklace, and most of these were decoration for some kind of necklace that you could simply wear around your neck. And you can see simple painted from stone core examples to quite a bit more elaborate ones where they found they could daub glass onto the side of them and they would form something that looked a bit like an eye. So from that they carried on doing that and made all kinds of weird shapes out of the simple formations of a cube. You can see that there is another face in this one, and this one is perhaps a deity, and they created odd shapes as well by forming glass into odd shapes. And these things are of various quality, but you can see the sand core in them is breaking through with time. You can see the actual sand that these were cored from, and they are sometimes clear as well, of something worn around the neck. And they also created what looked like bars or batons made from this stuff, where they had a longer stick and they dripped glass over that and painted that and dripped more glass over it until it became this sand core. As far as I know, I'm not quite sure how they developed this, but you can see they used limestone in the middle, and you can see that still remains on these sand core examples. And a bit later on they created deities as well, which they stuck onto the sides of whatever they were crafting. And in these examples you can see maybe these came from the same area and the same batch, and they were made into necklaces. And of course black and white was the easiest colour to get hold of, followed by red and blue, and they also had purple as well. And it's very unusual to find Phoenician purple in these examples, but it does exist. And you can see intricate designs even later on. Now, the more intricate they design these things, you can tell the later on they are getting, and maybe even some of these are Phoenician style reproductions, because you can see very clear glass. And the original Phoenician style core was actually pretty rough and ready. So by the time you get to this stage, this is more of tourist item trinkets that they're still producing in the same style. And definitely in the later period, you can see more ornate examples, which came from maybe 200 or 300 AD under the Romans. But the original ones were very much more traditional, very much more spread out, because nobody could afford a huge big necklace back in those days. And you can see more later examples when the Romans industrialized the whole area. When they invaded, they modernized the whole area and they made a production line. You can see perfect examples now of beads, handcrafted still, but custom made to go onto necklaces, and those beads are often exactly the same, made by exactly the same producer, so you can often get complete necklaces made from the same type or a similar type of this bead. And then much later on we get even clearer examples and much more ornate examples which may or may not be Egyptian, but you can see they did go to great lengths with this Phoenician glassware umbrella name. So you can see lots of things on eBay marketed as Phoenician, and some of these are questionable as to actual dates. But you can see on this example, you can still see the limestone sand core in the middle of it, and that usually gives away that these things are pretty ancient. The first examples of rings were, of course, very rudimentary, and they were formed around sticks which you took off. And I think maybe you can see examples here with that face again, perhaps from a deity, and they had many deities back in the day. You can see floral examples as well. Maybe these were worn by male or female, and you can see some striking colours as well, some deep blues and some very striking reds. And it's unknown, but you can imagine that many people who could afford to wear these were actually striking in their colours, because if they had a ring on which was very beautiful, made from glass with very delicate, intricate, handmade designs made from manipulating glass, then you could imagine that the wealthy could boast that they had something beyond gold back then. And these formed rings can be amazing. You can see a knot, which was another symbol that they had back in the day. And of course, as they developed the ring system and found gold and found how to manipulate soft metals, then they incorporated them into the ring system. So you can see sand core formed tops on these rings. The rings themselves were obviously hand carved, but still the sand core remains. And the eyes, you can see, which are the major protection symbol that you could be wearing back in those days. Maybe the eye of the beholder, the eye of Horus. But you can see a stick has dragged through the colour as they were moulding this, and that creates all those weird patterns. And I think these are bangles, so yes, they did wear bangles back in the day of every colour under the sun, not just these examples that I'm showing you now. Every colour, green, blue, red, and you can see the intricate detail that has been fired into these sand core bangles. Another protection symbol was the fist, and in these examples that you can see, sand core pendant fists, you can see that, well, maybe the hand isn't quite in the fist. I'm not quite sure, because the actual symbol was to stick the thumb through it. You can see on this example, they've stuck the thumb through the fingers, and that's supposed to be a warrior protection symbol of some kind. And this is a much clearer later example where the thumb is sticking through the fingers. They also made pendants out of other things. You can see this one, I think, is made from sand core, or it could be jade, but if it is jade, then I'm looking at the wrong thing. But it's a shoe, basically, so it's kind of from the right period, and it was marketed as Phoenician on the internet, so I checked it out, and guess what? This thing has a stamp on the bottom of it. So they had their wild horses, they had their stars and everything else, so it has a foot stamp on there, so you can press that into clay. And this is definitely sand core, because you can see the air bubbles in it, and you can see the familiar pattern as well. This could have been a pendant. You also get frightening symbols, definitely on warriors' pendants, and if they didn't wear enough jewellery, you also get wards, which are supposed to be maybe friendly or evil protectors, which are supposed to ward off enemies and frighten enemies. And of course, with that task in hand, it's supposed to be a shock, like you're sneaking up on them and saying, "Boo, I've got you. Nothing you can get past me." And so that was the rudimentary element of these words, to keep away evil spirits by putting a bigger evil spirit there. And some of these, remember, gargoyles from the later period, that was basically the same thing, putting something really ugly out there, so that if something really evil, it will be really on there. But you can see these pendants are what most people think of as the Phoenician Sand Core pendants with the hair curlers in there. But those, as far as I know, were sold to the Mesopotamians, who were enemies, and these were sold to them because they were all big with their beards in Mesopotamia, at that region. And so these were sold to the enemies as a peace offering, because the Phoenicians did try to seek peace everywhere. So these wards might not necessarily have been worn by the natives, and a lot of these were produced for stalls by the wayside for, well, basically tourists to pick up, definitely in the Roman period. But you can see this type of beard definitely is more Babylonian, and this type of long beard perhaps was more Mesopotamian. I'm not quite sure, maybe beards were more fashionable in the north. But you can see those wards and evil gargoyle type creatures were worn and were sold to tourists around that period. And I've no idea when these were produced. If you look on eBay, it says anywhere between 300 BC to maybe 200 AD. And so you can see another example of a ward, maybe a pendant, worn, and they come in various shapes and sizes. Some of them are, well, big ugly creatures, and some of them are rather reminiscent of other things, and you can see maybe a lion creature here. And again, if some of these remind you of North Africa, well, yes, this was part of North Africa, and so some of these might remind you of tribal shields, and they probably got those decorative designs from that kind of area. You can see some Tyrian purple there, which is pretty rare to find on these artifacts. This is definitely sand core, because you can see the sand poking through the back of it. And also, of course, their deities were carved in a recognisable symbol, and that recognisable symbol was carved onto pendants and was placed on other things as well. I'm not sure, but they also worship Mithras and Baal and things like that, so you might find that some of these were annexed when the Roman Empire came along, and they said, no, you must do the Roman gods, and they were annexed again when the Romans said, no, you must revert to Christianity. So I've no idea what any of these deities are, but they made huge sense back in the day. And then you get the other type of ward pendant, which is what I call the funny face, and that is a pendant which was a standard kind of a funny face. Maybe this is the woman's equivalent to the warrior, and I'm not quite sure whether they were made by the women in the camp for the warrior to wear. But either way, you can see that these things are reminiscent of candy canes with the spiral effect, and nobody really knows how they created this, but somehow it was weaved into that glassware at this point by stamping one on top of another and layering bits of glass on top of another, and that created maybe a sun god symbol or a lion symbol or some kind of ward or some kind of ugly reminder to the enemies not to touch the inhabitants and the protectors of whatever that was. Now we come to the household items, including the dice. This is definitely sand core. You can see the air bubbles and the sand underneath it, which was worn through over time. And of course dice are one of the earliest forms of playing games, and they made those out of glass. In this later example you can see how they form things using that glass. But they also created lots of other household items, including with the wave effect. This jug may or may not be a pendant. It's very hard to judge the sizes with these photographs, but they did range from the very small to the very large, and some of these could have been production items which held actual water. You can see a lot of these have been damaged over time and repaired constantly as they've endured maybe 2,000 years. The standard form is definitely not clear. The clear form came later. The standard form is this kind of form, which is black, and that was also coloured in different forms, maybe fired like that. But on the inside it's sand, and on the outside they created this wavy pattern, perhaps reminiscent of waves, but what they did was, whilst that was still boiling, they dragged a very spiky object down that very quickly and they created this wavy effect. You can see delicate hand-drawn artwork as well, and maybe these clay moulds on the inside were only glass on the outside, and these were sometimes practical. You can see this is a pestle for grinding grains to make bread, and that's well worn, and maybe some of these pestles are decorative. I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely got the shape of that. You can see in this example it's a spoon which has a sand core interior and a glass exterior. And if you're higher class, you could even afford a cup made from glass. And of course these aren't clear, but the same deities are on the outside. The same wave format is on the outside. And on the inside you'll find sand, the original sand which these were fired from. And you might find eyes as well, protection eyes dotted everywhere. Rings, bracelets, wherever you could fit an eye, they put an eye. And of course that reminds us of Greek culture, where they used to put eyes on the sides of boats. And you can see another deity which reminds me of a mummy. But yes, this was an authentic deity back in the day. And that blue guy again, maybe this was one deity to rule them all. If you couldn't find a deity, you stick this blue guy on the ring or the bottle or the bracelet, and there are plenty of those dotted around. This looks like an Egyptian symbol, because don't forget the Egyptians also copied this sand core, and they also created their own bottles. And of course people from the Lebanon, the Phoenicians, sold bottles to the Egyptians, so maybe some of these had Egyptian gods and other things painted on them and stuck on them. Here's another example, and it's supposed to be a clear one, but of course it's sand coloured, because on the outside you have all of this wonderful hand-created blown, cored glass formation. It's not been blown, it's cored glass, and on the inside you can see the original sand that it was formed from. And sometimes they created a mound out of sand or a cone out of sand and drip glass over it. You can see this has been formed out of a mound, and they made all this formed pattern over it eventually, and that was scored out and carved out. It's still not clear, because on the inside, guess what you get? Yes, it's made automatically from sand. And so that's what you get. I'm not sure whether they ate out of these or whether they were decorative, but that's what they're made from, and that's what you get with these sand core Phoenician style formations. The eyes, the ripple effect, the deities, the limited amount of colours, and of course the sand coring. So that's what to look out for on these household items. When we get to decorative items, we can see pretty similar things which range in size. We don't know if these were for children or for the mantelpiece or simply decoration for tables. But you can see all kind of oddments made from mosaic. And mosaic was the art of daubing different colours on before perhaps you fired that thing or refired it. And those got formed into the glass, and that's what we know today as Roman mosaic, Phoenician style sand core glassware. And that's because it followed the same style, but it was daubed on with different colours, and that over centuries got known as Roman because they industrialised that process. And maybe again these were all on a market stall sometime in the Roman period, maybe 150-200 AD. They did mass produce things, and the entire coast was mass producing things, certainly the early ones, usually black, with very rudimentary things on them. The later ones are clear, and this is a Phoenician style. I'm not sure how old this is. It looks too clear to me because the old ones you can see have got the sand core, the air bubbles, the rudimentary designs, and quite intricate, quite beautiful, or quite grotesque. So it's not hard to see that these things are definitely from that period. We're talking at least 2,000 years ago, and whatever shape or size, and definitely people have guessed at 300 BC on YouTube, and I'm not quite sure of any of that because I'm not a scholar, but I do know that this is prehistory. This is, well, basically Bronze Age technology, the first glass blowing, and it wasn't blown, it was actually cast over sand. So you can see pretty gigantic creatures. Again, it's pretty hard to scale these with a photograph, and I imagine somebody had this on their mantelpiece, or maybe on their wall, because Phoenicians being a seafaring population, they sold mainly on the coast, all the way up to Devon and Cornwall, and they sold glass blown fish just like this, of various sizes, and some of these are big chunks of clay that have been formed into different fish, not just the same fish, not just by the same people, but definitely sand core, because this is a weighty item, and if you break this over somebody's head, it will just be sand in the middle. So you can see different types of fish from the same types of period, and this reminds me of Japanese fish, but surely they must have had some kind of fish which resembled these, and I'm not sure whether they had all these types of fish 2,000 years ago. Certainly fish like this these days don't exist in the Mediterranean. See this one with the familiar blue on top of it, and maybe a face, and some of these are for protection, of course, and some of these are fading away now. You can see the original sand on top of this poking through the top, and the candy cane effect. And this looks a bit like a salamander, or maybe some kind of iguana or something. It's definitely got that frog-like thing going on, and you might think that this is an ibex to one side, or it could be a unicorn or something else that died out 2,000 years ago. We don't really know, but they definitely carved elephants out of clay, fired them up, and made this mosaic style, which became very common at one point. And well, what could this be? Take your guess. I think that that's probably a zebra. And you can see protection symbols on that painted in yellow. The blue is definitely prominent on most of these, and maybe this was an oil lamp and something to do with oil, and definitely some of these had a utility value. You can see a very happy camel holding there some vessel for something, probably oil, and in those days that's all they had when the lights went out. And so you can see maybe a horse with a similar kind of design and protection symbol there, same guy. What is this? I've no idea. It could be, well, a dog, and it's got a guy riding on top of it. They definitely had the candy cane hair, and this one is definitely a horse with the same protection symbols and the Roman style, Phoenician style mosaic on there. And these were definitely tourist items by the time you get to this stage, because they were big, bulky and heavy, and the common people couldn't really afford this stuff. But you can see a lion, and you can also see the candy hair. Some of these have got really great vivid colours, and that beautiful colour of blue, and the candy cane hair. You can see the unique mosaic design is unique to all of these, and I'm not sure whether they painted the clay before they fired it. Probably think so. Put sand on top and that's what created this. I'm not sure, but you can see that that's what creates this mosaic design, and it was completely random. Every single one of these is a unique one-off item, so you never get two things the same again. And of course, dark-haired people with a norm. This is a light-haired guy riding what looks like an elephant, and light-haired guys were very uncommon unless they were selling this to the coast, maybe in England. And so now move on to totems, which is what I call anything else, which is a kind of a figure which may or may not have a utilitarian use. So this could have been a meat grinder, a stone grinder, or something to do with something, a meat tenderizer, we don't really know. But these are in the shape of cows and bulls and bison and water buffalo and elephants and camels and horses and all different types of things, all beautiful, all made from this mosaic design, with the more intricate parts in solid colour, which were added obviously over the top later on. And so those have remained the most vivid colour after all of these centuries, and the most used parts aren't. So going back to the totem idea, these are usually to ward off evil spirits, and again this could have been something for the mantelpiece. I doubt that warriors were carrying these around with them or using them as weaponry, so that could only mean some kind of trophy. And so these wards or gargoyles, or whatever you might call these, are all made from sand core of all different shapes and sizes. Some of them were very small, the size of a thumbnail, and some of them were big and meaty and big enough to grasp in a hand. You can see the same blues, the same yellows throughout these things, and the same sand coming through, and I'm not sure what kind of deity these were meant to represent, if they're meant to represent anything other than some kind of grotesque to ward off those evil spirits. We also find fertility wards and things like that, and this one is obviously modelled on the female character, who I think is using breast milk, and so fertility charms and things like that. This corkscrew one, I doubt that this was a corkscrew, maybe it was a tree planter, but whatever it is, you can see that these things were created using that effect with the solid colours later on. It's very rare to see orange, but of course they did have all of the colours of the rainbow, including purple, which is probably the rarest of them all. You won't see too many pink either, so perhaps they did blend colours together. Usually blood red from beetles is pretty easy to get hold of, and of course green you can get from any kind of jade or emerald or any kind of vegetation, things like that. Maybe these were cast from precious stones, and that's why this glassy effect took effect. No idea. You can see some gremlins, all kinds of shapes and sizes. These are unmistakable from that period. This is early mankind. These are 2,000 years old at least, and the rougher that they come is definitely older that they are. By the time you get to more formed items, more delicate items, then they are laser formed, and so we don't know when these were formed, and most of the things you'll see are 300 BC, that's probably just a guess. You can see another fertility charm, and these fertility charms may have been handled by women and maybe had those under a pillow, I'm not quite sure, but those definitely existed, as well as the male equivalent, the phallus, and I noted about 50 of these online when I took these pictures, and so I only took basically 2 photographs of them because we don't really need to see endless images of phalluses. They did create them all over the place, they are there. By the time you get to glass blowing, then the Romans are the ones that usually take credit for that. So by the time you get there, usually it's later on, definitely maybe 200 to 400 AD, and glass blowing you can see is a Phoenician style, but it's not Phoenician in the classic sense. You can see Roman is much clearer, it's a solid colour, and it may be sand core, but you don't get these kind of solid colours because Roman, just like everything that they did, was perfect, and these immaculate colours and these immaculate things were a bit bland and not hand painted, and so that's how you can tell that these are Roman. They're too clever, they're too clear, and in this clear example it's almost like modern glass. The Phoenicians did not have access to this technology, and this is an Egyptian bowl, definitely too clear. It's got the eyes on there, but it's too modern, too clear. It may be Egyptian, it may be sand formed and they've simply scrubbed that off, but it's just too modern to be sand core. So you can see in these examples, this is beads that I bought, and according to, again, eBay, these are all supposed to be 300 BC. I'm not quite sure if I agree with that. They're definitely not as clear as the later ones. They're definitely black with things carved on the outside, so that means that if they're black and not clear, then that's usually BC, which is a huge relief because it's great if they are BC. That means you've got something that's old. So these are definitely BC. How old they are, I've no idea. I've put these on a rose gold chain, but it's not strong enough to hold these because of all this sand core. It's pretty weighty, so even though this is a thin chain, you can imagine from the original one that I showed you before, it didn't have tons and tons of beads on it like a modern one. It had a bead very occasionally, and maybe it had some kind of twine to hold those together. Certainly it didn't require something like this, which is pretty darn heavy, and it's too heavy for me to wear. And I also got a couple of wards. I got one of these happy face wards, which I just thought was great, and it seemed to be me, a happy face ward. I've never worn it, but it's there, and again, that's pretty old, it's solid, and so you're talking BC, whatever it is. So these were pretty common for seafarers and people travelling the waves, I guess. So warrior aside, these things could have been worn by the ancients a long time ago. You might remember that tribal kind of shield thing that I showed you before with the Phoenician purple on it, and I spotted this with the Phoenician purple on it. You can't really see it in this light, but you can see this is the very one. It's again quite weighty, and it's got a deity or a grimacing mask on the front, again reminding me of maybe the Zulu wars and things like that, but I've no idea. It's supposed to be there to ward off evil things. It's got a weight to it, it's got an energy to it, like it's old, and it would require some kind of weighty chain on its own, but I mean obviously it's not too weighty because it's only made from sand core. I'm just saying it's a lot weightier than you would imagine it would be. Lastly, yes, the horse that you might have seen with the guy riding on top of the horse with the great kind of cyan colour. It's very unusual to find that colour of green mane on the horse, and it's got these protection symbols on, and it's got the guy on it with the candy cane hairstyle. When I saw this, I just had to buy it, and of course if you want to buy these you can pay any kind of money. I paid, well, not a huge amount for this because it was sold in a museum sale, but it specimens on this. If you want to go out and buy now, definitely anything up to £500 is not uncommon for something like this, a decorative item from 2,000 years ago. They're only going to gain value, and because they're all unique, it means every single one of them is a unique item, which is unlike other forms of artware. And of course the later Phoenician glassware was pretty standardised, so to get these unique grotesques reminds me of the late 1970s new wave bar, and maybe that kind of generation will adore these kind of things massively, and the price of these is going up daily. So yet again, it's one of them things that you know about but you don't. So that's my collection, and that's as much as I probably know about the Phoenician style moulded sand core glassware.